Okay, the higher critics will probably, if they concede that, they say, oh yeah, they had Hebrew slaves in Egypt, as well as other people, what's the big deal? Well, what about the events what about the plagues of the Exodus? Sure, there's no evidence of that. Oh, there's a lot of evidence of that. And it's called the Ipuwer Papyrus. Ipuwer. What is the Ipuwer Papyrus? And that is an ancient Egyptian account of the plagues leading up to the Exodus. It's also called the Song of Ipuwer, because Ipuwer was an Egyptian priest who is said to have witnessed those events. And he wrote about this 40 to 50 years later after it happened. It's called the Song of Ipuwer because it's written in stanza form, just like the Song of Solomon. Okay, now this was found near Memphis, the capital city at the time of the Exodus. During the early 1800s, it came into possession of Giovanni Anastasi, a Swedish consul to Egypt in 1828. Later, it was purchased from him by the Dutch National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden, Netherlands, where it is today. So it's in the museum in Leiden Museum for the whole world to see. And the British Egyptologist Sir Alan Henderson later translated into English in 1909. Is dated around 1400 BC, some 50 years after the Exodus. This is significant because this was long before the Torah, the 5 books of the Testament, were put together and made available. So it's not a copy. It can't be said to be a copy because we can date this through radiocarbon dating too. It's over. The Ipuwer Papyrus clearly uses the word plague and blood, precisely paralleling those same words that are used in the book of Exodus. Now let's take a look at the chart. Okay, see on the left it's the Ipuwer Papyrus. Plague is throughout the land, blood is everywhere. You read across, it says there was blood throughout the land of Egypt. The river is blood. All the waters in the river were turned to blood. And you could, for Papyrus 210, they give it certain sections, names. First through gates, columns, and walls are consumed by fire. The fire ran along the ground. There was hail, and fire would make them with hail very grievous. Forsooth is like behold. That was the phrase, as I said, language changes over the years. And that was the phrases that they used in ancient Egypt. Forsooth means like, look, behold. What prompted this writing? Why did Mr. Ipuwer, the pagan priest of Egypt, write this? The reason why he wrote it is because he was complaining to Pharaoh in retrospect that they should have listened to this man named Moses. Otherwise, these things wouldn't have happened to Egypt. And then he lists the names. It was a complaint that, look what happened 50 years ago. There's other writings about the Jewish presence in Egypt. They were allowed to practice their religion. And there's other writings that said that that the Egyptian people were glad that they got rid of the Jews because they didn't like their religion. They thought their religion was, according to the Egyptians, their religion was unclean because the Jews were allowed to sacrifice animals. The Egyptians never sacrificed animals. So how about that?
Pretty awesome.
How about that? It's pretty clear cut. And so far there's not very many, I haven't read any objection by the higher critics, so they ignore that. Because it's kind of hard to refute. Let's go on to the ancient map of Egypt now. Okay, we have it right here. Okay, you see where it says Avaris? That's where the majority of the Hebrew or Jewish population was housed in Egypt. Concentration. They were housed in the south where they did agricultural work. But there was a big concentration of Hebrews at the time of the Exodus in the city of Varus. Did you know at the time of the Exodus, Varus was the largest populated city in the whole ancient world? It had a population of 250,000. That's slightly less than Buffalo, New York. That was very big by then, and there was a very big population by then. And if you go to the north, go to the next one about a virus. So that's a virus, and you see where it says Pi Ramses and those numbers there. Those are storage facilities, just like the Bible said they would build places to store grain. And that's what they did. So the Jews lived in the southern part, a little below the river there, and then they would work there. The Egyptians would store grain even before the Exodus. You know how Joseph, when he was under Pharaoh, when they had the famine, he said store 1/5 of the grain. I read somewhere that bankers say that you should save 20% of your money, put in a savings account, HMA. And so I read somewhere where they got that idea, believe it or not, from Joseph in the Bible. So they build those storage places, to store grain. All right, now let's go to the burial pits of the virus. Okay. Now, it so happens that in modern times, within the last 30 years, they've discovered hundreds and hundreds of massive burial pits in and around the city of Avaris. You can see the bodies are haphazardly thrown around there. There was a sudden death there. And there are scholars, Christian scholars, and even secular scholars who believe that this is related to the Exodus. You could very well be looking at the firstborn that were struck down, because they threw the bodies hastily into these graves. These were not carefully prepared burial pits. They were thrown away very quickly. And as you can see how how one body, the skull on top is facing one direction, you see at the bottom is facing another direction, perpendicular. That's not the normal way the Egyptians buried their dead. They know that not all Egyptians were buried in tombs or wrapped as mummies. Now let's go to a normal burial pit. Okay, that's a normal burial pit. This person is facing east, where the sun comes up. The ancient Egyptians believed that the sun god Ra. Other ancients believed that the planets and the sun were heavenly bodies. The Egyptians believed the sun was actually a god, and every night they would worry that if the sun god Ra was not happy with the Egyptians, he wouldn't come up. You wouldn't have a sunshine. You wouldn't have the sun. So when they buried their dead, they would place them to the east. And you could see the pots there. Even the ordinary people, as well as the pharaohs, believe you could take things with you. So he or she is taking the pots with him to the afterlife. Yeah. So these are. So there's massive amounts of. There was massive death. It's unexplained, but we think that's a proof of the firstborn. Okay, now let's go on to something even more dramatic. You want to talk about a lot of evidence about the exodus of the Jewish people into the Sinai Peninsula. And these are referred to as the Sinai inscriptions. There's a lot of them. Sinai inscriptions are ancient carvings in the rocks of the Sinai Peninsula. Guess what? There's 700 of them. And they're mostly concentrated along the western part of the Sinai, along the coast. This is not a modern discovery. They were known since ancient times, and the ancient Bedouins who lived in the Sinai Peninsula referred to them as the inscriptions of Moses. Since ancient times they referred to that. Okay, the earliest mention of them was by the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus in 10 BC. And writing in his literature, which is called the Library of History, many volumes that he wrote, he said that the Sinai Peninsula, there's a very old altar of hard stone bearing an inscription in ancient letters of an unknown tongue. This is trilingual inscription. Now the higher critics did object to that. They objected to this thing brought out, about the Sinai inscriptions. They say, we won't believe it until you show trilingual inscriptions. That is in hieroglyphics, in Egyptian written language, and in Hebrew language. The hieroglyphics would be the key because it would show that these were ancient, approximately the time of the Exodus. And that's found, and so the critics were confronted with that, and they couldn't say anything. So all right, so then we go also the Greek geographer Strabo, writing in AD 24. He wrote a 17-volume work entitled Geography, and he concluded that the language of these inscriptions were so old that the language was unknown at the time of Christ. What now, this unknown language, what is this unknown language? Okay, in AD 518, a Byzantine Christian by the name of Cosmas Indiciplastes wrote that the carvings in stone were written in Hebrew characters. Moreover, he concluded that the inscriptions in the rocks were made by the ancient Israelites fleeing from Egyptian captivity. Okay, more recently, in the last few hundred years, more additional light was shed on these inscriptions. For example, Bishop Robert Clayton of Ireland published a report on these inscriptions in 1753 in the Journal of the Franciscans of Cairo, in which he said that they were written in an ancient Hebrew language. See, we're zeroing in on things. However, the most significant discovery was made by the Reverend Charles Forster. He was a language expert. Reverend Forster translated a number of these inscriptions, included that these writings contained a combination of ancient Hebrew and Egyptian alphabet, which described the Israelis' exodus from Egypt. More specifically, Reverend Forster discovered that the language pattern of these inscriptions were Egyptian. For example, Reverend Forster found that 5 out of every 6 words were from the ancient Egyptian language known as Hamorite. It's I'll spell it to you. It's Hamyarite. Now, the ancient Egyptians, it's a form of Arabic, but the ancient Egyptians spoke differently 4,000 years ago than they do today. So the significance of these findings is that they support the conclusions that they were written by people familiar with ancient Hebrew, as well as the language of ancient Egypt. In short, it supports the Bible account of the Hebrew people living in Egypt and later fleeing to the Sinai. Reverend Forster published these findings along with photographs of these inscriptions in 1862 in a book entitled Sinai Photograph. It's a rare book, but it's available for people to know about for the whole world through the internet and other sources. Other classic and significant works have been written on the Sinai inscriptions as well. They include Sinai in Palestine, 1905 by Dr. A.P. Stanley, The Handwriting of God in Egypt and Sinai, 1862 by the Reverend D.H. Randall. In conclusion, and we're going to take a look at the chart of these inscriptions. In conclusion, among the compelling factors that the Sinai inscriptions describing the events of the Exodus are genuine is the fact that they're written in a style and manner that's very different from the book of Exodus. If these Sinai inscriptions were merely copies of the Exodus account, one would expect to find that many of the same words and phrases used in the Bible, we do not find that. We find it written in their own language. Instead, the inscriptions suggest that the writers were either first-hand observers of the events, or were told of these events by those who witnessed them. Another factor is we know we know how they were carved. They were carvings in rock, but they used a certain instrument that only the ancient Egyptians used. Can't be a modern forgery. We know by the language, because the language is ancient Egyptian language. The tools are not available today to do that. And here's a quote from, and then we're going to look at the charts. Okay, here's a quote from Reverend Forster's translation in his 1862 book called Sinai Photograph. The wind blowing, the sea dividing into parts, they pass over. How's that? Now let's look at the charts of that. That's another example of Sinai inscriptions. You can see they're ancient Egyptians, and they use a combination of ancient Egyptian and Hebrew. Okay, the wind blowing, the sea dividing into parts, they pass over. Okay, the Hebrews flee through the seas turned to dry land.
Oh my gosh.
See, Moses causes the people to haste like a free wind, and so and so. You know, so yeah. I mean, it's all there. I mean, it's all there to. As you can see, these are the real things. You know, 700 of them. You know, and long been known for centuries by the Arab Bedouins who lived there. Notice the inscriptions of Moses. People depart fugitive. A mighty army is submerged in the deep sea. The only way of escape for the congregated people. See, it's not written like the Bible. It's written differently. It's written in their own idioms. So see now, let's recap. Let's recap all this. All right. You know, you're with somebody who says, oh well, you know, the Bible's not true. You know, it's a fable. There's no evidence. You know. Well, what about the Brooklyn Papyrus? You can't say Brooklyn Papyrus. You got to say Brooklyn Papyrus 14:1445. You have to remember that.
14:1445.
Yes. 35:1445. Then that's the ancient list of Egyptians. Say, well, how do you know it was later on? You know, not before the Exodus. You know, list of so-called that Pharaoh's name, fancy name. You know, Mr. S. Pharaoh S. III, you know, and we know the date, you know, and we can also verify it with handwriting, with the style of language at the time, and also radiocarbon 14 dating. Okay, what about the events of the Exodus? The Ipuwer Papyrus. Who was Mr. Ipuwer? He was a pagan Egyptian priest. He was considered to be an eyewitness, and he wrote that as a letter of complaint to the Pharaoh. We should have listened to this man named Moses. He brought the wrath of the Hebrew God on us. So when they say they sometimes the ancient Egyptian writers, they'll talk about the wrath of God. They're not talking about the one true God. They're talking about the God. They refer to it as the wrath of God, but they're referring it to the God of the Hebrews. They still believe in their gods, but they believe that the reason why they didn't listen to Moses, the God of the Jews got mad at us. And were the Egyptian gods to counteract the true God? I don't know where the Egyptian gods were, but you know, they believe that it was brought on by the Egyptian God, not the true God. What about the burial pits? Great possibility that you know, the mass burials were the death of the firstborn. Sinai inscriptions. You want to talk about a lot of evidence? There's 700 of them along the western coast. There's some in the central. There's some that includes the 700. The 700 includes every of them. But the majority of the 700 is along the west coast. In 2005, Doug Petrovich, he was an ancient Egyptian language expert. He translated the remaining ones. It's the same thing, you know. And also included in the Sinai inscriptions were inscriptions, the history of Joseph in Egypt. That too is verified. There you have it. There you have it. Those You have the Brooklyn Papyrus, that fragment. You got to remember the number. You got the Ipuwer Papyrus from the Egyptian priest. And that gives a chart of the calamities. And then you have the Sinai inscriptions as well as the Devourer Spirit. So this is all there, you know. Those basic. You don't have to know the details of when these documents were discovered, who bought them, and that. You just need to know the contents of them when they were bought. You know. Another sideline is if you go to Britannica.com and type of Sinai inscriptions, they're going to talk about ancient languages, but they're not going to talk about mention of the Hebrews, about Moses, about the sea dividing. That is censored. I looked it up. I went on the internet. I went to Britannica.com. That is cut out. If you really want to find out some good things, you know, you need to go to Christian historians. You need to go to Christian archaeologists. They will tell you. The secular ones, they will give you bits and fragments. Grant Jeffrey, he passed away a few years ago. He used to be on TV and radio. He did a lot of research into the Sinai inscriptions and all of this. He's a good source for me. And there's other Christian, Bible.ca, it's a Canadian website. They talk about Doug Petrovich translating remaining Sinai inscriptions. Go to the Christian sites. You know, the secular sites you're not going to get anything there. So I mean that's basic it. I hope this was interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.